Enrique Iglesias has served as president of the Inter-American Development Bank for just 1 year. When he assumed his present post, however, he brought to it a wealth of experience in the world of banking, Latin American politics, and Latin American economic policy. Soon after graduating from the University of the Republic in 1953, he began his career as managing director of the bank Unión de Bancos del Uruguay. Between 1962 and 1966, he served as technical director of Uruguay's National Planning Office, developing and implementing its first national economic and social development plan. He headed his country's central bank between 1966 and 1968, and then served as chair of a group of experts to study Latin America's economic situation under the auspices of the Inter-American Development Bank. He was named Executive Secretary of the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean in 1972, first with the rank of UN Assistant Secretary General, and then as Undersecretary General until 1985. The commission is based in Santiago, Chile. He left the UN to become Foreign Minister of Uruguay. In 1986, he chaired the meeting of ministers which convened to launch the Uruguay round of multilateral negotiations within the framework of the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade. He is a professor at the University of the Republic. President Iglesias has a reputation as a highly analytical, pragmatic, and skillful negotiator. From 1985, upon the return of democracy to his country until he assumed his present position, he served as Uruguay's foreign minister, as I mentioned earlier. In his spare time, he's an opera buff and an avid reader. It's hard to imagine him having spare time. Will you join me in welcoming our distinguished guest this evening, President Enrique Iglesias.
Well, I like to thank the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs for this opportunity to address to you and to do it in such a beautiful place where I can have my first view of this city in my life. I've never been here before, only crossed through, but this is a fantastic opportunity to admire the beauty of this place and to be tempted to become again soon. I want to thank your invitation also because it's an expression of the interest that this council and you personally have in Latin America, and it is an opportunity for me to talk to you on our region, our problems of today, and also our hopes of tomorrow. The Latin America is, as we all know, in deep troubles of several kinds, basically economic troubles. And we are in a very important moment in many ways. Important because I think there is a clear awareness everywhere on the nature of our problems. There is a strong determination in overcoming them by our political leaders. There is a clear pragmatic approach, less ideological than we used to have in the past, more open for dialogue and cooperation. And I must say there is also a big hope in this administration in this moment. I think that all the signals that we are receiving in the last 2 or 3 months are very positive ones. And there is a great expectations on the produce of cooperation instead of confrontation, and a real partnership between our two parts of the Americas. And I am also very hopeful because our institution, the Inter-American Bank, is one important piece of this potential cooperation, and we like very much to work on that. So to speak about Latin America today is to speak about our problems, about our present difficulties in the economic and the political field, but also to speak in a very specific moment in which there has been a change in the administration here, but also I would say there is also a change in the world, and we are part of the world, and therefore we cannot ignore that there are several things happening today, and we are ending the century with a spirit of relief in many ways, both particularly in the economic field and in the political field. And this is also part of our assets of today. When you look back in the past years, we have to recognize that we are ending the century with many accomplishments in the political side. Peace appears to be now closer than ever, the solution to the regional conflicts. The new mood also in the world level between the big powers, between East and West. This new scenario in which dialogue seems to be the best answer to solution of the problems instead of confrontation. And a clear signal that really we are ending the Cold War. I was reading the other day a very important article in one of your major newspapers saying the Cold War has ended. No? So in a way, this is in this new kind of a spirit in which we have to place our problems and to place our future possibilities. It is clear also that we have some economic concerns at the world level, and some of those concerns are basically some of the major imbalances that still persist in the world. People are worried about some of those imbalances, fiscal imbalances, trade imbalances. People are worried about the fact that savings are in one side of the world and consumption in the other side, and there is some need of reconciliation between these two approaches. There are people who are also concerned about the management of the major variables in the world, financial and economic matters. But I think that together with these concerns, you have to accept, and we have to accept, that this last year has proven that there is a capacity of administration of the problem. One has the feeling, after living for quite a few decades in this field, that the major difference to the past is that today governments, and we are finishing yesterday these big meetings of the IMF and the World Bank, there is a clear signal that there are crises in the world, there are risks, but we are getting used to live under a high-risk situation with management of the circumstances. In other words, I have the feeling that the governments or the leaders are ahead and not behind the problems. And that's very important, because that is really a major opening to hoping that through this mood we can really get the problems solved. So the Latin American situation has to be placed in this particularly mood in the political front, in which cooperation seems to prevail vis-à-vis confrontation and a kind of understanding of both sides what their positions are. And the economic front, potential risks, but we are learning to live with those risks. Nobody can tell that the situation cannot explode tomorrow, but at least we have the feeling that the control of the situation is in the hands of the leaders, is in the hands of the governments, and that there is a resilience in which the system has been able to avoid major political disruptions and economic disruptions. In the last 20 years, were living the final stages of the capitalism. We lived through the famous crisis of oil, the crisis of the petrodollars, and now we are confronted with one of the major crises which has to do with Latin America, which is the debt crisis. And I think that in the same manner that those major apocalyptic forecastings were overcome by facts and by wisdom, I think also in this question of the debt issue we are going to get through with wisdom and goodwill. It is in this context in which I like to make a few comments about Latin America today, where we stand, what worries us. Let me tell you that, first of all, certain facts which are not very nice in terms of Latin America. In fact, when you look back in the 80s, this has been one of the saddest and most disappointing decades for the region. Our standards of living by the end of the 80s will be smaller than the beginning of the decade. In other words, there are countries who today are worse than they used to be in 1980, and some countries worse than they used to be in 1970. So there are people, states, nations in Latin America who today have lost 10 or 20 years in their standard of living. That, as you can imagine, is a major source of economic concern, but it's also a major source of political and social concern. Growth last year, after the debt crisis started at the beginning of the decade, has been also declining, 1.5% in per capita. In other words, the situation, in spite of these 7 years of adjustment, is still not showing results or not showing good points for the Latin American population, and that is a major concern, the first of the concerns. Figures also tell us that together with this declining in growth and this deterioration in the standards of living, investment, and I insist that always, is showing very poor performance. In the 70s, we were investing 25% of our GNP, more or less. Now we are investing only 15%. Among other things, because a good part of our investment capacity has to be sent abroad to serve our accumulated debt. And what does it mean to reduce investment by 1/3? Well, it means a lot. It means not only that we have less economic capacity to produce more, it means also that our social capital has been eroded. We are suffering from erosion in the nutrition, erosion in education, erosion in health. All the social indicators, in a way or the other, has been very badly hit because of this decline in the social investment of the region. And this is something which is being accounted today, but also being accounted in the future, because this kind of deterioration in the social indicators is creating problems for our new generations, for our kids, affecting then their capacity to serve the society in the coming years. So this is another impressive element coming from the figures. Also, another impressive element from the figures is that Latin America, so well known by its inflation temptation, is now worse than used to be 2 or 3 years ago. Inflation is rampant in many of our countries, and inflation is perhaps today much more serious and much more important for many of our countries than the debt issue. And how to get out of it, I will come back later on. So the figures are disappointing, with some exceptions. This is not true for all cases. There are countries who are doing reasonably well and they are overcoming their situations. Other countries might overcome them according to the recent trends, and others we are not certain whether they will do it or not under the present circumstances. So the figures are really disappointing, and this is why we can call the 80s as the lost decade in Latin America. In some cases, there are 2 lost decades in Latin America, and even more. So this is what creates this sort of difficult panorama, and also the certain feeling of fatigue in Latin America, because after many years of fighting and trying to rebuild society, there is a feeling of fatigue, economic fatigue, social fatigue, and to some extent also political fatigue, and I also will come back later on. I don't want to mean by that that not everything is going bad. There are also reactions in the region. I think there is a better consciousness of our problems, as I said before. There are reactions in different fronts, and that is something which must be pointed out as a good asset to look to the future with hope. But the balance of the region, and this is what you see in the papers every day, is a conflicting situation, and in some cases a dramatic situation. You have seen very recently what has happened in Venezuela, one of the most progressive and the most dynamic countries in the region, that has perceived in only 3 weeks ago more than 300 people dead in the street because of the riot. And this means something that has to alert us, has to concern us, and therefore has to put us to work on why this happened and what can be done to solve it. Now, if I had to make a list of different critical fronts in the region, I would single out 6 or 7 areas which would characterize what are the critical problems of the region of today. And you will notice that that is only one of these 6 or 7 fronts. And I want to single out this because traditionally it's now becoming very customary to say that that is the issue in Latin America. Yes, it's a very important issue, but it's not the only one. Our crisis is a basket of critical fronts, and we must be very conscious of all of them if we really want to address the solutions with some hope of solutions, of success. One of the first critical fronts in the history of the region is that we lost our capacity of a dynamic insertion in the world economy. Latin America followed many years the patterns of substitution of imports. We did this as well as other countries did, but we remained there, and we went too far. And as a result of this, Latin America today is a very poor performer in the international markets. And we have a very small percentage of participation in world trade, which is, as we all know, this city knows very well when you look what this is around these beautiful windows, that really trade is one of the major engines of growth in the world. And you cannot live without these trade dynamics. Latin America lost momentum. And this is something which put our region in one of the worst performers in international trade. At the time in the 60s and 70s when the world trade was booming, Latin America was very passive. And that is one of the first fronts in which we have to acknowledge our critical situation of today. A second front, a second critical front is the crisis of the government. I'm not making, in this case, an ideological issue. I'm saying only that as a pragmatic result of an excess of voluntarism, we went too far. And nowadays, government in Latin America in general is extremely inefficient and is not a real creator of resources, but a consumer of resources without really having a productive utilization of them. The question, therefore, of the revision of the government in the economy and in society is one of the major challenges and one of the major critical points. And it's funny because if you ask this today, you will notice that this is no longer an ideological controversy in Latin America. Almost everybody agrees. There are always nostalgics or extremists, but in general, in the intellectuals, in the public opinion, everybody agrees that we have a problem there, that we went too far, and that the government is today a major block to the capacity of growth of the region. It has to be revised. Not only revised in terms of reducing the deficit, but also reducing their presence in the economy, perhaps doing more in certain cases by doing better and with less intervention in the economy. This is one of peaceful conclusions that leaves the history of recent years. A third front of critical situation for us is the crisis in the whole price system in Latin America. In fact, we were very complacent with instability in most of the countries, not in all of them, in the majority of the countries. And as a result of this, we played too heavily with inflation. In some cases, inflation became a major tax from the upper classes to the lower classes. Inflation is, as we all know, one of the most regressive systems of social justice in our countries. In other cases, inflation in closed economy made a tremendous impact in the agricultural sector in favor of the industrial sector, which was, in a sense, the presence of the cities against developing in the agriculture. And which is much worse of all, inflation became deeply rooted in society in Latin America. And we have now something which you have never known in this country, and it has been known not even in Europe, because the big inflations in Europe lasted 2 or 3 years. Now we have inflations in the region 20 years, 30 years, 50 years of inflation. So the whole society is adapted to live with inflation, and living in some sectors living very well. They are coexisting with inflation in a very dynamic way, and therefore the people are getting used to defend themselves in the inflation. And therefore now for us inflation is much more serious than it used to be for Hungary or for Germany in the period of hyperinflation, because you are fighting against a mechanism in society which has a lot of clients living out of inflation and defending inflation because they are getting a lot out of it. And then to break it is a tremendous, not only it's not a question of economic formulation, it's a major political problem. How to dismantle this vested interest that boom with inflation, which are deeply rooted in the agents of society. That's another front of our crisis. Of course, I put now the crisis of debt, and my order is not accidental. I think debt came to our countries in the 70s as a result of the easy money of those years, as a result of the recycling of the petrodollars and the easy access that was given to our countries and the thirsty for external resources that is always in the developing countries, and also in some other countries who are not developing. So that is not a disease only of the Latin American countries, as you very well know. But in our case, the debt was, the question of the debt, sometimes I was asking myself, how come that we were not alerted of what was going on? We reached at the end of the 70s with a total debt of $200 billion, more or less. And at that time, we have certain signals that aren't going too fast in this question of debt. Why were not we alerted? Why did the World Bank, the IMF, ECLA, whatever other institutions were in place, alerted that things were becoming unmanageable? Well, in fact, we did not recognize the problem at that time, because there were certain elements in the international markets with which we were playing consciously or unconsciously. Interest rates were almost negative, exports were growing very fast, and therefore we all had in mind that inflation would pay for it. That was, in essence, one of the reasons why debt was never something that shocked us very much. At the beginning of this decade, inflation was stopped in the world, and some of the interest rates went very high, and sometimes reaching very high levels, unknown levels in the history of modern world. And also, the terms of trade, the prices of our commodities collapsed, and as a result, these $200 million became, in 3 or 4 years, $350 billion, because we had to take more money to pay our interests. And as a result, this make the whole debt issue becoming a major problem in the region. Today, the debt of Latin America is $420 billion, more or less, in total. At the beginning of the decade, we thought that there was a liquidity problem, that the debt issue was a simple matter of getting more money to gain time to recover from that with the upsurge of the economies. Nowadays, and particularly with the arrival of the new administration in this country, I think there is a peaceful acceptance that that is not only liquidity problems, it's a solvency problems. There are countries who simply cannot serve the amount of the debt which they have now in their books, and this is why there are now new solutions coming in, like the debt reduction schemes or the debt relief, which is now being considered in a very dynamic way by the international organizations and the major industrial countries. So the debt issue is there. In the last 7 years, we remitted abroad $180 billion to service our debt, which is an enormous amount of money. It's more than 1 year and a half, almost 1 year and a half of our investments in Latin America. And therefore, we are remitting abroad 5 or 6% of our GNP in some cases. And this is what depresses the economy internally, reduces the capacity of investment, and creates an anti-climax, because this is a vicious circle. As a result of this high indebtedness, as a result of this money to be sent abroad, the foreign capital does not come in, the capital flight is not coming back, and new money is withdrawing from our countries. At the beginning of the decade, we used to receive $30 billion a year. Now we are getting $3 or $4 billion, and only to get money to pay to service the interest. So there has been a shrinking of our resources, and these combined elements of more money to be sent abroad to serve interest and less money from outside because of the concern about the Latin American economies is dumping us in a very serious crisis. So the debt now is no longer a liquidity problem, the debt is a solvency issue, and this is one of the major issues of critical fronts that we have to face in the coming years. Another front is the social crisis of Latin America. That is another problem which has to do not with the recent events, but with a long history of inequities in Latin America. We used to say that out of the 400 million people that we have, 130 million live in so-called social or extreme poverty. That means that we have almost 1/3 of our population living in abject poverty. And that is a serious problem because it goes hand in hand with unemployment, with the growth of our cities, with marginality, with poverty in the rural areas, etc. A very important byproduct is that we have a lot of informal sector in the economy. There is a lot of people living out of the market, trying to survive in the informal sector and trying to live out of the market, but surviving with all kinds of activities. Whoever goes to Latin America and goes to Lima or goes to La Paz or goes to Mexico, they will discover these large amounts of people, millions of people living in the cities as part of this marginality, which is one of the best indicators of the social crisis of Latin America. The 80s have seen not only a crisis of these people. One of the major problems of today, and that explained Caracas the other day, is that now the crisis has been touching the middle classes. In essence, the crisis of the 80s in Latin America is to a large extent a crisis of the middle classes. And this is more serious because the middle classes have a bigger capacity of expression, a bigger capacity of political mobilization, and a bigger capacity of these big noises that we are seeing now in Latin America. So it's the traditional crisis of inequity in the distribution of income and in the presence of a small group of society having most of the resources together with a large number of people with absolute poverty, but also the fact that the middle classes have been deeply affected because of the crisis of the 80s. And this is a new phenomenon which we have not seen before. Finally, I would say we have also a potential political crisis. The decade of the 80s has been a decade of recuperation of democracy in many of our countries. My country is one of them, and we are not alone. Argentina, Brazil, and others were, in essence, becoming democratic in the last decade. Nowadays, we have the beginning of some contradictions. I don't mean that democracy is at risk. I'm saying that democracy, in a way, can be affected if the situation of economic crisis continues and there is not a rapid and quick reaction to the measures that are being taken by governments in that respect. So this is the first message I want to leave with yourselves. The crisis is not only a debt crisis, it's a combination of things that come from the past and all together present Latin America with the major challenge this region had since the big depression of the 30s. The question now is what to do. How do we face this issue? Well, I think that we must have two major fronts. One is an agenda for modernization of the region, and secondly, an agenda for international cooperation. That means that we are not advocating, as we used to do in the past, for solutions coming from outside. If there is something today duly accepted by everybody in the region, is that the solutions will come basically from inside. There is no one, even with the best intentions, that can solve our problems from outside. But, this being said, time can be reduced if we can have an enlightened international cooperation which goes hand in hand with the efforts of internal economic and social adjustment in Latin America. When you talk about an agenda for modernization, we must list a series of areas that has to be tackled in this effort in the region. Modernization means also to have some kind of poverty strategy. We have few resources to face it, but we must use them well. Therefore, the need for a poverty strategy or a social strategy, and Chile has done a very beautiful case in recent years of attacking poverty through targeting the specific areas of society which are suffering from problems. In other words, what we need is to have a real strategy in which poverty is being addressed specifically, including these marginal areas that I mentioned before. The fact that we have now in Latin America millions of people living in marginality outside of the market should become a problem to us. And our bank is trying to do something in that respect, because I think that's one of the ways in which we can face the possibilities of poverty strategy. Of course, modernization would imply the transformation of the state. That's an area where, thanks God, everybody is in agreement, as I said before, and many things have been done now in Latin America. There is a movement in different countries through adjustment in fiscal deficit, through privatization of certain enterprises, through modernization of the public enterprises. In essence, there is a consciousness, because of the facts, not because of the ideology, that really this cannot go on like that if we want really to modernize the region and we want to use properly the scarce resources at our disposal. Now, this being said, we need to move together with this to a new international agenda. And this is the area where I expect a lot from our dialogue with the United States and with our industrial countries friendly to us and linked to us for many historical and economic interests. Let me tell you that this international strategy, I think, starts first of all with a debt strategy. We have seen now in the last month a new approach by Secretary Brady, which we welcome. I think it's a badly needed approach, because it's a recognition that after 6 or 7 years of a strategy based on more money to pay interest rates, waiting for recovery, in some cases did work, in other cases it might work, but in most cases it will not work only if it is reduced to that, and then we need to move to new courses into the menu. And the proposals made by Secretary Brady and accepted yesterday by the G7 and basically also by the all industrial nations of the world, I think is a sound one. And I am very happy to notice that this strategy goes in the direction that many of our countries have been advocating in recent years, and it is to me a very important road to tackle this important issue. The question is how to put together international organizations, industrial governments, and creditors in the world so that they can comply with performance criteria, certain steps toward debt reduction, giving rise, therefore, to more resources for investment in the countries and in new frontiers for advancement in production in the whole region. The second front is trade. Latin America has been a very strong advocate for trade liberalization. In the final analysis, if there is no trade liberalization, there will be no solution to our problems. And the success of the Uruguay round of negotiations under the GATT Egypt, which is now these days in a very crucial moment in Geneva, is fundamental for our problems. We need to have opportunities, and in that sense your country has been very open. This continues to be one of the more open economies in the world, and we welcome that. Therefore, it's an imperative element that in this very moment, if we really want to bring progress to the whole world and solutions to our own world, we need to fight heavily for open the markets. Protectionism is our worst enemy, and unless we recognize this, we will be very short of success in any other measures we do in the debt strategy or in other fronts. Another element of this international agenda is new sources of fresh money. It's not enough to reduce the service of our debt. It's extremely important to have also some resources to help the region in this precarious time in which investment resources have been reduced so dramatically. And that's the point where institutions like ours had to play a certain role. I think at the time when the private sources are very timid, very shy to come back again, and I understand why. At the time when the capital flight is also very reluctant to come back, It's very important someone to break this vicious circle, bringing confidence. And this is a time where international organizations like the World Bank or Inter-American Bank should play a certain role. And I'm very happy to see that our institution got 2 weeks ago a major replenishment of our funding so that we can perform an active role to stimulate economic investment, to stimulate social investment, and as a result of this, to be front runners in opening these vicious circles and trying to create creditworthiness that could promote more foreign investment, would promote also more capital fly into the country again. So I think in this particular moment, fresh money is essential. Fresh money implies, of course, to go hand in hand with the tremendous effort of saving mobilization in the countries. But to that effect, the role of multilateral organizations like ours is a very important one, and I hope we can perform a certain role in that respect. So, in essence, and summing up my comments, we are in an international environment which is more hopeful today than used to be yesterday, in the political front and the economic front. We see with great hope the courage to face some of the basic imbalances like the debt one with new approaches. That is a healthy and a very good news for us. Number two, Latin America has very serious problems, but not impossible problems in any country. I am confident. I think we're going to make it. We need a tremendous internal transformation, but this is a time when we need, and at the time Latin America is becoming more pragmatic, more responsible to their own problems. I think it's a time to have a solid cooperation in the other hand. Why it is so? Well, first of all, we are in the same region. We share the same values. We are part of the Western civilization. Our interests are very strongly linked with your interests. And this is why when I read in the media that there is a growing interest in this administration for Latin America, I can only say that I am very, very pleased. And this interest is becoming even greater when I see that the people, the society, the groups, the economic groups, are also joining in this interest.
There are two questions, I believe. Into what areas will you be funneling money? And I don't know whether you mean geographic areas or sectors of the economy or both. Sectors of the economy, first of all. And then secondly, how do you prevent capital flight?
Okay, for the first question, our bank is basically committed to the two areas, the economic and the social area. We had a history of social commitment, which is one of our best prides, because 50% of our resources, in a way or the other, should try to be addressed to the poorer strata of society, which is very important. If you travel all over the place, you will see the bank present in housing, present in water, present in sanitation, in rural development, in micro enterprises. So that area of social commitment is very important. And I must say that if I had to put an emphasis in the social side, I would say human capital. Human capital is the major resource of any society. I would like to see the bank in areas like health, nutrition, areas of basic food, areas which do with the consolidation of the human capital in a broader sense. We have several ideas to work together with UNICEF and other institutions, because I think that's a very impressive area. We need to work for the future, and the most important investment of any society is people. We must invest in people. Now, on the economic front, each country has its own priorities. It must be defined with the bank where to put the money. We are always a small portion of the investment. We must be catalytic, you see. And I think that one basic area is export side, for instance. Because as I said before, the poor performance of Latin America in the export side is one of the major problems today for its development. But I would mention also infrastructure. You couldn't imagine the deterioration of infrastructure in the region because of these 10 years of tremendous depression of our investment process. 10 years in which the governments had to reduce sharply their investment almost to zero. then you have now shortages of everything, of energy. You have blackouts everywhere in Latin America today. You have shortages of roads, of ports. So, in essence, the infrastructure component of our role is very important. And I think that's an area where we had to put some emphasis. So, let me stop in these two areas, export and infrastructure. Of course, we have all the others, agriculture, industry, etc., but these are two important elements which I like to mention. Now, your second question is a little bit more complicated, because how to avoid capital flight, this is something which is an ensemble of solutions, which basically has to do with sound internal macroeconomic policies. You see, the people do not leave the country because they want to normally. They leave because they are insecure, because they don't know whether the assets will we sustain, whether they... So in essence, this is a tremendous vicious circle. So we need to reestablish this confidence atmosphere, and for that purpose we need more investment, we need more resources. You see, it's a perfect vicious circle in which we are trapped, as many other vicious circles in the region. So the answer to your question is, well, sound economic policies and a good international cooperation will create an atmosphere in which capital flight will not be the best option for the people, but to stay and invest in the countries and produce in the country.
Would you comment upon the extent to which land reform remains a fundamental hurdle within the economies of the countries of the region?
I thank you for your very perceptive question. I think you give in the question the answer to your concern. Yes. I think you are perfectly right. The major success of Korea or Taiwan or Japan, but basically Korea and Taiwan, has been that their export drive, which is the basis, the flower of their success, has been export drive. But because they started from a position in which they were able to do at the end of the war, these tremendous land reforms. We were not, and this is one limitation. So I think we have a problem there. Some countries are addressing it in some ways, and I think they are discovering that if I still remember, you see, when I started to work in the 60s with the whole question of planning, we used to be very much fixed in our minds with this question of land reform, because we've seen the inequalities of the country owned by a few number of people and the lower productivity, etc. And for us, at that time, the issue was basically a question of size and a question of ownership of land. That remained to be very important issues, but recent history has shown us that, as well as these are very important issues, the whole question of price system, the whole question of good commercialization mechanisms, the whole question of an integral policies towards peasants is also very important and can give impressive results if you really achieve particularly good price rewards to the agricultural sector. So I take your point and I agree completely with your concern. I think it's true. But in this moment, we must also be concerned on the management of the basic pricing policies in the agricultural sector, technical assistance, commercialization mechanism, which have always a very impressive response. And I think both things, reform and this question of price mechanism, should be kept in mind to sustain any other development policies in the countries.
Two questions. First of all, does the Venezuelan model for economic reform serve the rest of the countries of the area? And secondly, within Venezuelan change, how important is education?
Well, let me tell you that Venezuela, the new administration, must be credited for the courageous drive towards change and modernization of Latin America. They are doing this with a tremendous political courage and social cost. I think their measures are in the right direction. What the government is trying to do is to make things more clear, to avoid inefficiencies, try to use the price system more efficiently, etc. And I think they deserve all kinds of respect for that. I think that they are not alone. Other countries are doing the same. Mexico is doing a dramatic change in that sense too. My own country, Uruguay, Chile did it also, and other countries are moving in that direction. now Prime Minister Manley is trying to move in the same line, which gives you the feeling that really we have learned a lot. We have learned a lot. Very costly lessons of history, very costly. But we have learned. Now the question is, we know where we want to go. We are very much wiser than we used to be 10 years ago. We know where the bridge ends. The question is how to make the bridge and to have the time to reach there. Because this happens at a moment. People have fatigue. People are tired. 7, 8 years of recession, of unemployment, of decreasing standards of living. Mexico has lost 50% of the standard of living. Could you imagine if you take a middle American that they are going to be reduced their standard of living by 50% in 2 years' time? Could you imagine the social impact of this kind of thing? So that explains to you why this eruption of control of the situation and the social implication of these elements. You see, to me, there is a consciousness everywhere. The question is how to gain time to reach there. And this is why I come back again that international cooperation should and must play an important role. Then you raise the question of education. Absolutely agreeing with you. See. The efforts of Latin America in that field are not negligible, are very impressive. In 1950, we used to have in the universities of Latin America 250,000 people, 500,000 people. Now we are having 8 million people, and half of them are women. Very important. No, I mean, because it's very important. Many of our societies are very conservative, and women play a very, very limited role in society. It's extremely important to notice that almost half of them are women. So the impact in the higher education has been very strong. I have the feeling that we have been deteriorating in recent years in the primary education. Some of the social indicators have shown, and this is one of the aspects of this crisis of the 80s, that we are going backwards, that we are losing people in the schools, that we are not finishing their period, etc. So that there has been a deterioration of the tremendous drive towards education, particularly in the lower bases of society. But of course, without education there is no progress, and there is no democracy, the two things together. Neither progress nor democracy. So I think this is a tremendous impact and a tremendous challenge for us.
Would you comment upon the problem of overpopulation and perhaps the resistance of upper classes to change?
Well, I think the two things are important keys in any development effort, no question. And I think the question of population has been addressed in Latin America, perhaps not enough, as it should be, but it has been a clear... You can hear that? Okay now? Yeah. I think that the 2 points you raised are very important ones. The question of population, as has been done in many countries, has been in very impressive efforts. Costa Rica, Colombia. If you read the statistics of the population in Latin America, people think that we are still in the figures of the 60s. It's not true. There has been a very impressive achievement in reducing population in many countries in the region. Perhaps not enough, but they are doing that. This being said, we must also recognize that the question of population is a very complex issue, which involves economic, social, and moral decisions, which are not simple, and I think everybody agrees on that. My feeling is that the region is today much more conscious than it used to be before in that aspect, and they all recognize that the movement must go hand in hand with development. It was one of the most effective elements in which population has been addressed is when development took place, education took place, and therefore decisions were made in the right direction. But I don't ignore the issue. It's a very basic one, and I think that some countries are addressing it more effectively than others, but we have been working in this issue for many, many decades in Latin America, trying to make of this a major question of population problems and population policies in the countries. The second question of the ruling classes is a very basic question. It's a question of the political dimension of development. You see, if the ruling classes do not awake on the nature of the problems and are not ready to take the decisions that has to be made to overcome the problems, then there is no solution. Without political decisions and political leadership, there are no solutions. I have the feeling, after so many years in this region, that our leaders are today much more alert than they used to be before. We went through so many mistakes, through so many bad experiences, that I have the feeling when I see the new leaders coming in, young leaders, the new presidents with the new ideas, fresh and courage. When I see the old leaders, like we mentioned, like the president of Venezuela, who has doing things, or Manley, who are trying to change in some of the things they said before, that gives to me some hope. That's what I can tell you. Problems are difficult. Without leadership, there is no solution. The ruling classes must understand that we are reaching a problem in which, unless there is change, social movements can take the lead, and then disorder can be the solution. And I think in that moment, nothing is good, because we have tried everything before, from autocratic governments to democratic governments, and we realized that without real social understanding of these issues and real pacts between the classes in the region, there is no solution.
I think the question is, how well can you develop the internal markets within the countries of the region, and compare that perhaps to what you've identified as the great demand to export into the markets of the world?
Well, I think that we have an internal market and we must use it properly and efficiently. Of course, when you speak of internal markets, the internal market of Uruguay with 3 million people is not the same that the one of Brazil with 140 million people. So for my country, there is no other alternative to export. When you come to Brazil, or you come to Mexico, they have other options of the internal market. Then you move to the integration process, which could be one possibility. We are exploring it, and we have explored it. I think that it is true. There is no reason why the internal market cannot be expanded. There are areas which are incredibly weak in Latin America. You mentioned agricultural production. There is no reason why Latin America could not be much more active in agriculture as used to be, as could be, because of the endowment of resources and even the experience we have reached in recent years. So yes, the internal market is a major component of our development strategy, but we have learned that in an integrated world, the whole question of foreign trade plays a very important role. And we know that even the deepening of the internal market is dependent always in international integration of our economies. That is a rule of history. You too are discovering that. You were a closer economy 20 years ago than you are now. And you are now expanding your own economy, and this is one of the problems that Madame just mentioned before, the need for filling this trade gap by expanding your export is one, or reducing your imports in some cases, but export exposure is one of the major elements of your strategies now. This is why the dollar is moving and trying to stimulate your capacity of capturing external markets. So I think it's correct, but we cannot give the region the lesson that led us to the situation of today, in which, because being too much inward looking, we have lost many opportunities of the world. I am a strong believer in the internal markets in the context of an open economy. If this is not the case, we risk to fall into obsolescence, technical and economic unproductive schemes. We cannot ignore the international markets, including in that international market the integration schemes. It's a balanced approach, and we have too many mistakes in the past that have given us very, very hard lessons. The second part of your question is, we have always questioned ourselves, do we really have enough room for so many people who want to export more? That's a very important question. That divides the world in the trade optimists and the trade pessimists. Because everybody wants to do the same, from China to Taiwan to Soviet Union to Italy to Uruguay. Everybody wants to export more. Well, I am in the side of the trade optimists. Look, if in 1950 someone would have told at that time that in 25 years the world had to swallow Japan Korea, Taiwan, the Asian countries, and we had reached the amount of trade of today, we would have told them, you are simply crazy. This is simply impossible. The world cannot absorb a Japan, a Koreas, and these kind of things. Things happened. And if you read the statistics of recent years, trade is growing. I think we must bet to trade optimism, is my personal impression. And in the case of Latin America, still, our participation is so small. We used to be 5, 6, 7% of the world trade. We are now 2, 3%. That we cannot, you see, we cannot accept this as the alternative. We have to move fast into integrating our markets into the world, because that will be a precondition also to go faster inside. This is the lesson that Brazil is learning today, is the lesson that Mexico is learning today. And as a result of this lesson, now they are deepening their internal markets because they are more active in the international markets. I would not advise the countries to go back to the past in terms of closed economies, because that would not be the best solution for a region that already made that experience before.
Should the greatest debtor in the world forgive the debts of other nations?
Well, what I could do, I don't know what I could do. I wouldn't take the job of Secretary of the Treasury for sure. I don't know. I think your problem is quite different from our problem. You see, it's true you have a problem. There is an imbalance. There is an imbalance there. I think that the most important difference is that you always have someone who would like to put the money to serve your debt. That's the difference with our case. We don't have Japans around us that you have in this country. No, I think you have a problem with imbalance. I think this administration is very conscious of that. And I think they are trying to tackle the issue. I think they declare themselves sensitive to the whole question of the trade deficit and trying to reduce it in order to avoid it. Now, let me tell you, don't do it very quickly in our interest, because this deficit of yours is our capacity to export to this country. So be careful and go slowly, okay?
This has been an extraordinary evening. We appreciate your sharing your wisdom with us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for your attention.